In this lecture, we are going to look at the structure of the spinal cord and a little bit about how it functions. And then we'll look at nerve pathways using reflexes as a way of understanding simple nervous pathways. So the spinal cord is made up of, well, first, the spinal cord, it extends here from the foramen magnum, right here, it's foramen magnum, all the way down to the first lumbar vertebra. So L1 right here. After that, the spinal cord kind of flays out into a number of nerves there. So there's the length of the spinal cord. It's about 18 inches long and about as thick as, say, the thumb. You can think about that hole in the foramen in the vertebra. That's where it passes through. And it is continuous all the way up here to the medulla oblongata, up in the brain. And it's completely enclosed by the vertebral canal. And it's got two primary functions: to conduct information up the cord. So we bring in sensory information from the body, and then there are sensory tracts that carry information up the cord. And then in response, we send down motor commands back down the cord, and then there is also connections across the cord. So, so that is the first function, is to communicate up here to the brain. The second function is to produce what are termed the spinal reflexes, these involuntary, so a reflex, it's involuntary and completely predictable response to any kind, not to any kind, but to very specific stimuli coming in that the body will respond to, and generally in a protective way. So when we look at the gross anatomy then of the spinal cord, it has 31 spinal nerves, each coming from one of the segments here of the spinal cord. And each spinal nerve that is coming off arises from what are termed the nerve roots, and there are pairs of nerve roots on each side, and they exit from the spinal cord. They're at the intervertebral foramina, so there's a space that is produced where the two vertebrae come together, and there's space there that allows the spinal, the dorsal root and the ventral roots of the spinal nerves to exit. All right, so we've got a cat that wants to be on the table with me. Okay, so the dorsal root, that is again posterior. The dorsal root, it has only sensory fibers, and there's a dorsal root ganglion right nearby, right near to the dorsal root, and that is where the cell body for the neurons, these sensory neurons that are bringing information into the spinal cord. The ventral root is motor, and it transmits information then away from the central nervous system. So it is afferent. The ventral root is afferent. I'm sorry. Yeah, it is afferent. No, I'm sorry. It is efferent. There we are. I got it backward. Efferent, while the dorsal root is afferent. So distal. So here we can see the dorsal root and this slice of the spinal cord. Here is the ventral root, and distal to them, the dorsal and ventral root join together, forming the spinal nerve. So how many spinal nerves? There's 8 cervical spinal nerves, C1 to C8. There are 12 thoracic nerves and 5 cervical nerves. And then That shouldn't be cervical. Dadgummit. It should be lumbar. Finding all my mistakes here. So 5 lumbar nerves. And then a single coccygeal nerve. So down there at the coccyx. So that would be this one right here. Okay. So 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, and 1 coccygeal nerve. So, looking again at a little bit of the anatomy of the spinal cord, the maximum width is about a little bit more than 1/2 inch. And there are 2 enlargements along the length of the spinal cord. There's an enlargement at the cervical area and an enlargement at the lumbar region. And these are where the nerves, they're enlarged because there's a lot of nerves that are heading out to innervate the arms. So that's coming from that cervical enlargement. And then also coming out to serve the legs. That's there in the lumbar enlargement. It's somewhat flattened dorsoventrally, and on the anterior surface there is a deep fissure right there, and on the dorsal side there is a sulcus on the up here. See, so here's the sulcus, but that anterior median fissure is fairly large, very visible, where the sulcus is a little less visible. And they divide the spinal cord into a right and a left half. So if this is anterior, then this would be the left half, and here's the right half. And again, because we're looking at it from anatomical view, from anatomical position. The central core of it is where we find gray matter. So here are the cell bodies and the dendrites and any unmyelinated axons in the central portion. And out here, it's white matter. So here's where the tracts are. Remember that a tract is analogous to a nerve. It's a bundle of axons in the central nervous system. So these are the axons all in the exterior portion. The interior is where the gray matter is. This is the reverse of what we see in the brain, where the gray matter is at the cortex and the white matter is deep. Here the gray matter is deep and the white matter is superficial. Come on, there we are. Okay, so the gray matter is composed, of course, of the cell bodies and any unmyelinated processes, unmyelinated axons and the dendrites. And it's also where we find the neuroglial cells are all there in the gray matter. And of course, where the cervical and lumbar enlargements are, there's also more gray matter in those regions as well. So if we think about this as kind of resembling an H or a butterfly, if we think about it as the H, the crossbar here, that's this region, is referred to as the gray commissure. Remember, commissures are regions where we connect the right and left side of the central nervous system. It is here, rather than being white matter like we see in the brain with the that large band of white matter that connects the right and the left half, here it's gray matter, and it surrounds the central canal. So right here is the central canal, very, very tiny space. Sometimes it's just just barely even there. It's like almost a potential space. And that central gray commissure, it's composed of the axons that are connecting the cell bodies on the right side to the left and the left side to the right. We also see what are referred to as horns. These are columns of gray matter. They're the posterior horn. Here's the posterior horn. the anterior horn here, and then the lateral horns are right there. So there's little projections of gray matter, and the posterior horns contain the interneurons that synapse with the dorsal root neurons, or with the axons coming in by the dorsal root, and they bring in the sensory neurons and any visceral, the somatic and the visceral sensory nuclei are all found here. Remember, nuclei are clusters of cell bodies. In the anterior horns, we find the nuclei that are sending out motor responses. So they activate the skeletal muscles, and again, they're largest at the cervical and the lumbar regions. And that's, this is a big piece of what creates the cervical and the lumbar enlargements. And the lateral horns, then, these are tiny, much smaller projections, and they're primarily seen in the thoracic and the upper lumbar segments of the spinal cord. And they have the visceral motor neurons of the autonomic nervous system. That's where we find those cells, the cell bodies and the interneurons that are all involved in the visceral motor responses that are autonomic. So the anterior horns, they are voluntary muscle movements, whereas the lateral horns are autonomic visceral responses. Okay, so that's the gray matter. Let's look at the white matter then. The white matter of the spinal cord is composed of the myelinated, and sometimes there are unmyelinated nerve fibers here, and they run in three directions in the white matter. They can be running up to the higher centers of the brain, bringing in sensory input, so any of the afferent communication that runs up in tracks that running up, they are bringing in sensory information. On the other hand, if we have efferent communication, that is information that is running downward through the spinal cord, that's going to be bringing in or taking out motor responses or transmitting information to lower levels of the spinal cord. And then there are interneurons, there are axons and that are running across the cord from one side to the other. And by far the vertical fibers are the most abundant. So we have fewer white matter communicating across the cord than we do have white matter communicating up and down the cord. So the white matter is composed of what are termed tracks. Remember, these are bundles of axons that originate in the same regions of the spinal cord and brain and terminate in the same regions of the spinal cord. And they generally have similar functions because they're all heading out to the same area of the body. They're going to have this similar functions. So the ascending tracks, they generally conduct sensory stimulation upward, and they're primarily bringing in general sensory receptor information. So we have not talked about sensory receptors yet. They're the general senses and what are termed the special senses. Special senses have specific organs. So we're talking about hearing, taste, vision. What we talk about is equilibrium, and what am I missing? Taste, smell, olfaction. So those are the special senses, and they run all the special senses. That information, sensory information coming into the brain, is all carried on the cranial nerves. So it is these. So up there in the brain is where those tracks are found. The ascending tracks in the spinal cord are all about the general senses. These are senses like touch and pressure, pain, warm and cool reception, and something called proprioception. That is the sense of where our limbs are in space, sort of how the joints, where they are in joint movements. That's all proprioception. So that is the sort of sensory information that is coming in through the spinal cord. The descending tracts, these are the motor impulses that are being sent down the spinal cord from the brain or up higher in the spinal cord. And we see these tracts repeated on the right and the left sides. So we have similar pathways on the right side as the left side. And they're named for their origin, where they begin, and for their termination. So the first part of the name is the origin, and the second part of the name is the terminus. So the spinothalamic tract, for instance, begins in the spinal cord and ends in the thalamus. So that would be an upward or a sensory tract, where the corticospinal tract begins in the cortex of the brain and terminates in the spine. So that would be a downward or a motor tract carrying information out toward the body. Okay, so we understand a little bit about ascending tracts and descending tracts and how they're named. Most of the nerve fibers in the spinal cord are decussate. That means that they cross over from the left side to the right side of the spinal cord or of the medulla oblongata. So below the neck, what we see is contralateral transmission of information from the cerebral hemispheres. So once we get below the neck, we see that the information transfers across the spinal cord, so that we're receiving information about, and so if we're looking here, we're looking at the body anteriorly in anatomical position, information that comes in on the right side of the body is decussate and is received on the left side of the brain. And motor impulses that are headed, that originate on the left side of the brain, they come down and are decussate, and they tell the right side of the body what to do. Okay, so we talk about contralateral transmission of both transmitting impulses and receiving impulses. So the receiving information, that would be sensory; the transmitting information, that would be motor. At the head and the neck, most of the sensation and control is ipsilateral. They're on the same side of the body because the nerve fibers are not decussate. Now, that's not true of everything. I say most because the optic nerve is decussate. Remember, when you looked at the optic chiasma, there's a crossing over there where the right eye is, the information is received on the left side of the brain. In the left eye, its information is received on the right side of the brain. So some of it is contralateral, but most of it is ipsilateral in these non-decussate fibers. Okay, so now we're ready to talk about reflexes. Reflexes, again, are these rapid, predictable, because they always produce the same response. Involuntary, because we don't have voluntary control of them, even though it is skeletal muscle that is affected. So these are rapid and predictable but involuntary motor responses to stimuli. And generally, reflexes are protective. They are like withdrawal reflexes that are pulling an arm or a limb away from a painful stimulus, or they are part of the control that we see that helps to maintain homeostasis in the body. So a reflex arc is a nerve pathway that begins at a receptor somewhere. So for instance, in this receptor, we have a receptor here in the skin. It's a pain receptor. Here is a sensory neuron that is bringing information toward the spinal cord. We have an interneuron that's connecting that sensory neuron then to a motor neuron that shows a response. In this case, maybe withdrawal response. You reach out, you touch a hot stove, you receive that pain stimulus. We quickly send an action potential along that pain receptor. It will synapse with an interneuron and then sends out a motor response to the biceps brachii and the brachialis muscles, and poof, we get a protective flexing withdrawal response. So the components, the very simplest of reflex arcs may only have two neurons in them, with a receiving neuron that first has a receptor, and that may be just dendrites of the sensory neuron, and then a sensory neuron that picks up that information, and then in the central nervous system there's an integration center. In this case it would be this interneuron here. In the very simplest of reflexes, we may just, have a sensory neuron bringing information in, a synapse, and a motor neuron sending out information. So here's the cell body and here's the axon. Here are the receptive cells. So this would be the very simplest of reflex arcs with no interneuron. And there is the integration center. That synapse is the integration center. And then a motor neuron that conducts motor impulses away from the integration center. And then at the far end, an effector, could be a muscle or a gland, that is going to respond, that produces the effect. So that is a reflex arc, and they are the simplest of nervous pathways. Cat's back. All right, Cat, you're out of here. Sorry about that. We're talking now about the functions of reflexes. They generally remove or oppose the original stimulus, and so they are examples also of negative feedback systems or mechanisms. So we can describe them by their structure. If it's a monosynaptic reflex, there's only a sensory and a motor neuron. In this case, we have no interneurons. So the knee-jerk reflex, the one that the doctor tests when he or she takes the hammer and bangs at your patellar tendon, that is a monosynaptic reflex. Or it could be a polysynaptic reflex. These are where there are one or more interneurons involved. And there may be several interneurons involved there because there's a lot of information that's being transmitted in some very complex reflexes. We could also define them functionally as autonomic or visceral reflexes. These are ones that would activate smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or a gland. And these are also ones that we do not perceive consciously, these autonomic or visceral reflexes. And there are somatic reflexes. These are ones that activate the skeletal muscle, and most of the spinal reflexes are autonomic. I apologize. There are somatic reflexes. The autonomic nervous or reflexes, they are found at the medulla. A lot of them are found there at the medulla and other regions of the brainstem. All right, so let's go back for a second. So just one last thing I've described in your notes several types of reflexes: the stretch reflex, the deep tendon reflex, the flexor reflexes, cross-extensor reflexes, and then some of the superficial reflexes. So I want you to pay attention to the notes there and just notice them. Make sure that you understand what's going on with them. I'm not going to talk about them. I think it's pretty straightforward information. Okay, now that completes it. As always, reach out to me with an email or drop by my office during office hours or make an appointment and we can talk about more of this. Okay, now we're going to end it.